Hello everyone, this is part 31 of What If Naruto Got Lost During His Training TS, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. The Konoha nins that were on the southern coast sent messengers back to Konoha, in order to inform the leaders of the country about the battle that had taken place. While not really a battle, it was still something worth reporting. Along with the messengers that were sent, the injured were also sent back, at least those that were within reach of their allies. The ones in the water had little chance of surviving. But the Konoha nins had to try and rescue them. Mitarashi Anko was one of the Tokubutsu Junin that were hidden in the trees. She really was of the impatient and bloodthirsty sort, and seeing all the snakes and serpents, she chose to attack. Retaliate. Following her were a number of others. They decided that waiting was not going to do them any good. It did not appear that the enemy was going to move forwards for a while. Well, if the enemy was not going to advance, then the Konoha forces would try and get their comrades out, while at the same time deal some needed damage on the invaders. Summoning a giant serpent of her own, Anko made her way down to the beach to engage the larger snakes that were showing up and down the shore, and in and out of the water. Her allies, the ones that had decided to not follow orders, dashed down into the water and onto the beach and everywhere else in search of their fallen friends and compatriots. They expected the soldiers that were on the beach to not be as fast as they were, but contrary to what they believed, the soldiers sprang into action. While the basilisks were taking on the summoned serpent and Anko, the soldiers that had landed ran at the dashing Konoha nin. They ran at the defenders, swords drawn. Spearmen and pikemen held their weapons and tried to skewer the Konoha nin where they stood. Seeing as the Konoha nin had revealed their locations and were actively battling the Rosuto forces, the dragons in the air began the dive bomb tactics, while their riders shot out projectiles at the scurrying Konoha nin. The rocks hastened their transportation duties, the more the merrier. Some of the impatient samurai opted to jump into the water and run on the water's surface in order to do battle with the shinobi. Some of whom brought their horses with them as well. The samurai trained horses were somehow trained into being able to walk and run on water. This turn of events surprised the Konoha nin, allowing some of them to be taken down. Other Junin and some Chunin remembered that they had summoned contracts with other animals and decided that screw orders, they would engage the enemy with all the firepower that they could muster. Summoning bears, different types of cats, a few kinds of birds, the summoners directed half of their summons to attack the enemy, and the other half to take their injured allies back to Konoha. The crocs saw the summons as things that they could swallow, so they focused their attacks on those. Some of the dragons opting to aid the crocs in that endeavor, by roasting some of them. By this time jutsu from the shinobi were flying everywhere. Bushins of all kinds aided their creators left and right, while some nin opted to multiplying their weapons. Leaving the rescuing of the injured to the summoned animals, the shinobi focused on attacking the invaders. They spewed out mud balls, water balls, fireballs, and other things directed at the enemy. But the enemy, having trained extensively, had some basic knowledge on those techniques and how to avoid them. The soldiers did not rely heavily on their weapons of choice. They had other things included in their arsenals of attack. Some of the soldiers took it upon themselves to engage the Konoha nin in taijutsu while also using what ninjutsu they knew how to use. Which was another thing that surprised the Konoha nin. Mato Gai was one of the senior Junin that were present in the southern border. He used jutsu to complement his taijutsu and was busy being mobbed by samurai. Hand-to-hand combat was his forte, but against people that were able to seemingly stand toe-to-toe with him, he was nearing the level at which he would have to resort to using the gates. Before he could even access the first one, a katana LD him through both his hands. One of the samurai had finally managed to hit him. After the first successful hit, he was subjected to being LD in a number of other places. With a sudden rush of adrenaline, Guy was able to push away his attackers, and force them to remove their blades from his body. Once his attackers had been forced back, he opened the first gate as quickly as he could. A visible aura of power sprung forth around him. The samurais wasted no time and immediately returned to incapacitate him. Due to his full concentration in opening the gates, Guy was unable to notice that he was once again being attacked. After the fifth gate was opened that he realized that the samurais did not halt their relentless attacks. Even with the advanced healing rate that one of the gates provided, he sported a few wounds on his person, while some of the samurai had dents and cracks on their armor thanks to Guy's aura. With renewed strength the spandex-wearing nin viciously attacked the samurai. He may not be one who hides in shadow, but he sure was fast. He plunged a chakra-covered fist through the gut of one of the attacking samurai, ensuring that the man never saw the light of day again. Following that attack, he spun around to decapitate another one with a kick to the man's en. He followed this up with an elbow to another samurai's solar plexus, resulting in not only knocking the air out of the man's lungs, but due to the power behind the blow, was able to snap the man's spine in two. Jumping away from the now slightly dazed samurai, Guy jumped into the air, and went through a seal sequence and spat out a burning Hao Gokakyu no Jutsu, frying his remaining attackers to ashes. When he noticed that his attackers were all he rushed away to the next fight, which was engaging another group of samurai and soldiers that had surrounded some genin, the fresh kind. Still in his super-powered up state, he being a speed freak, dealt as many blows to the surrounding attackers as possible, all the while breaking bones and outright king them. Once they were put out of their misery he turned to the genin and ordered them to find and secure any injured Konoha nin that they could find. Guy knew that he was nearing his limit in remaining in the state which he was in, any longer and he would start to endanger his life, which would not be beneficial, as there were many more of the enemy in the vicinity, and many more were arriving by the second. He quickly disengaged his power-up technique and closed all the gates, but as he was about to run over to help one of his other comrades, he felt pain race down both of his arms as well as both of his legs. He then fell to the ground in a heap. Standing over him was a single man. He was neither samurai nor soldier, but was a battle monk that specialized in medicine. On the man's face was a tattoo of the kanji for the number 2. Death is too good for a fool like you. You ked my comrades, now feel the pain of having broken limbs. I hope to one day get to fight you again, for now is not the time for you to the monk said. After saying his piece, the monk threw Guy to the trees in the direction that he knew that one of the chunin that were facilitating the beginning of the tactical retreat was. The chunin was surprised when the form of Mato Guy slammed into his person. He was also surprised to find the man screaming and shouting in pain. Moving quickly he motioned for 2 of the available Anbu to carry the injured taijutsu specialist to Konoha. When he looked back at the battlefield his eyes were caught by the gaze of the monk. As their eyes met the chunin gripped his chest, the space and above his heart, and SD of a heart attack. One of the other nin near his position saw what had happened in disbelief, and rushed to his comrade with the hope that the man was still revivable, but alas the chunin was They are pulling back Rosuto-sama, what are your orders? The monk asked his master via mental link. Allow them to take their injured, we still need nin to fight in the future, was the reply that the monk received. Let retreat, we have more important things to do. The monk bellowed out to his comrades in his immediate area. The officers that were in visual range of him noticed the tattoo, and quickly complied with the orders, and sent out runners to inform the others on the stretch of beach. All across the shoreline, every few hundred meters there was a monk similar to the one that had injured Guy. All of them had relayed the same message to the men on the beach. All of them also sported the tattoo on their face of the kanji for the number 2. The Konoha nin realized that they were being let go, and since they were given the chance to leave, they took it. There was a very small chance that they would be allowed to do so again. Swallowing their pride the shinobi left the battlefield, those that were still alive that is. All the were collected by the crocs and piled up. Halfway through the fight the giant snakes that Anko had managed to summon were dispelled and she was forced to retreat lest she become a bite-sized snack for one of the basilisks. The basilisks had ordered their lesser cousins to pursue the snake mistress. They were curious about the summoning contract. The overwhelming number of snakes was more than enough to catch up to the fleeing kunoiki, but they were no match for appearance of Gamabunta and Jiraiya who had combined their attacks to produce a massive ball of fire that roasted more than half the snakes, which wasn't much of a loss to the Rosuto forces. But it did cause the snakes to retreat back to the beach. Jiraiya had raced toward the border after he heard from his spies that it was possible for Orochimaru to have allied himself with the Rosuto forces. While it was not likely, he still needed to make sure, so he summoned Gamabunta to bring him to the southern border. It was a good thing that he arrived when he did since he was able to save the snake mistress from who knows what fate from the snakes that were pursuing her. The sight of so many snakes had, for him, confirmed that indeed Orochimaru was allied with the new enemies of Hai no Kuni, and by relation Konohagakure no Sato. Jiraiya and Gamabunta turned around and traveled back to Konoha with as many injured nin as the Toad boss could carry, most especially those that were in critical condition. Once they reached the village, the medic teams quickly went to work on patching up the injured nin. The village, thinking that they were safe from attack being so far in the country, as well as being protected on the outside by not only shinobi but by one of the armies of the fire daimyo who was also staying in the village, were more lax in their patrols of the perimeter of the village. The village was unprepared for what happened after all the injured nin had been entered into the village and the gates were securely closed. The first sign of trouble came when one of the Anbu patrolling outside the village returned battered, bloody and alone. The Anbu was escorted by medics to the Hokage Tower where he gave his report to the daimyo and the Hokage. The squad that he was a part of had been attacked while they were returning to the village by the shadows themselves. The attack was very similar to the way the jutsu of the Nara clan worked. The shadows attacked the Anbu squad. But unlike regular shadows, these ones flew away from the surfaces on which they were normally tied to, and lashed out at the nin. The nin were then forced to defend themselves from the razor-sharp edges of the shadows that had by then become black blades of shadow. The shadows slashed at the Anbu aiming to kill them. When the first of the nin fell to the ground, her entire body covered in cuts and her head lying motionless away from her body, that was when the rest of the squad began to panic. But due to their training they did not show their outright panic, but they did order one of their number to escape to the village and report the attack. It seemed as if that was what the shadows, or at least the ones that were controlling the shadows, had wanted, because just as the sole survivor had gotten away from visual range of his comrades, the screams of pain and agony echoed throughout that part of the forest. The Anbu did not slow down but sped up. When the screams had finally SD down, the shadows pursued the escaping nin and managed to severely wound him, which for some reason he had not been able to notice until he collapsed on the floor of the Hokage's office on death's door after ending his report. The medics that were accompanying the Anbu and the Hokage immediately went into action, but once the condition of the nin was stabilized, Tsunade left the office with the daimyo to talk tactics. Along with them were the master tacticians of the land, Nara Shikaku, and the samurai's version of the man. The monks had declined in transferring to Konoha due to their obligation in protecting the relics that were kept in their temple. While the leaders were coming up with plans on how to defend the village against the unknown attacker, the army outside would have a really bad day. The sun had set well over an hour ago, which meant that the land was covered in darkness. The men at the edges of the army as well as the sentries were the first ones to notice that all was not right in the world. The first sign that made them realize that all was not right in the world was that there were some people in the moving around the trees around them. The army had situated itself in a number of clearings. They were all spread out around the village. In the dense forest surrounding the camps, the sentries and the soldiers that were at the edges of the camp could see the shapes in the forest were moving around, seemingly forming a circle. But when some light was shone on the places where the shapes had been seen moving, the soldiers saw nothing. There was no evidence of anyone ever being there. When the light moved onto another place, the shapes in the dark started to appear again. Some of the soldiers that were at the edges of the camp decided to investigate and entered the forest, bring torches with them to light the way. When the soldiers that had gone into the forest decided that they were just seeing things, they decided to walk back to camp, but before they could take another step back, they found out that they could not move for some reason. Each of them also felt like something was physically holding them in place. Looking down, the soldiers saw that there were black hands holding onto their legs, and holding them in place. Before they could unsheathe their swords and try and cut the hands off, none of them could move their arms. That was when they realized that their arms were no longer attached to them. There was an illusion around them that made it possible for them not to feel the pain of losing their limbs. Instead of the soldiers holding onto the torches, the soldiers could see that the shapes that they saw in the darkness were actually people that were covered head to toe in black clothes, some of which were holding onto the torches. "We hope that your souls will be able to move on, nothing personal. Goodbye," was what was said to the soldiers before their muffled screams, anguish and death-filled cries rang out in silence for no one to hear. The shadows around the Rosuto Nin devoured all evidence of the soldiers being there. After all the evidence had vanished, the Rosuto Nins put out the torches and made their way to the camps to get rid of the soldiers that stood between them and Konoha. The Anbu patrols had already been neutralized long before they let that one Anbu return to Konoha. Their remains would never be found. When all the Rosuto nin were at the edge of the forest, some of their frontliners took out the sentries using a combination of Kage Main no Jutsu and Kage Kubi Shibari no Jutsu. Half of the Rosuto Naris ensnared the sentries with the surrounding darkness, while the other half moved their shadow and made it snap the NS of the sentries. Once all the sentries were taken out, the Naris then shadow walked to where the sentries were stationed and used henge to look like them, in order for the rest of the camp to not get suspicious. Once that was done, all the other Rosuto nin used henge to look like the other soldiers that had already SD. These nin then infiltrated the camps, and mingled with the soldier S. Come midnight, the real attack would commence for them. They were going to take out all the soldiers in one night. Then come morning they would take the place of the army, using different kind of bushin to solve the problem of numbers. They would not attack the village yet, they had to wait for the village to send out the nins that were going to protect the eastern borders. It would not do if their armies did not find any resistance. They all just wanted a fair fight. When the sun finally arose over the horizon basking the land in all its glory, Konoha had received word from the sentries that Fire Country had posted along the eastern border stating that there was a fleet that was preparing to deploy forces and enter the country over there. After going over the information of the initial attack on the southern border, Tsunade decided to send out some of the shinobi that she knew that could fight just as well on land as well as on water over to the eastern border. As well as send some other nin back to the southern border, there were a few fortresses scattered all over the country, a number of which could be found near the southern border. The daimyo had ordered some messengers to travel to those fortresses to inform the soldiers that were there to prepare for any possible attacks since the southern border had already been breached. It was bad not being able to form any form of wall to defend the country on that border. The daimyo also sent messengers back to the main camp of all his armies to send out some troops to the eastern border to defend that undefended border from the invaders that were making their way there. It would take time, but they had time. In the meantime, the Konoha nin would stall the invaders while the armies made their way to the eastern border. The messengers were allowed to pass by the disguised Rosuto nin. They were also able to glean some information from the passing messengers, which they passed on via the Nufu clansmen that were among them. They also allowed the Konoha nin to travel to the eastern border. They did not want to reveal their presence and intentions too early in the game. Not all the people in Hai no Kuni wanted to fight for their country. These people were labeled as traitors, but instead of being executed they were sent to the many prisons that littered the land. Not all of these people were civilians, some of them were soldiers, some of them were even shinobi of Konoha. Information about HTHE whereabouts of these people had been gathered by the Rosuto nins. They wouldn't begin their official attack until after all the innocentes in the war had been removed from Konoha. They didn't need any unnecessary casualties in the game. One of the notable traitors was a cause of many problems for the Nara of Konoha, since it was the wife of the Konoha master tacticians that was one of the traitors. Yoshino refused to go against her adoptive father Sunio, even though he wasn't or hadn't yet been seen to be participating in the fighting, but it was highly likely that he was somewhere, at one border preparing to storm the country with his horde of puppets. Another member of Konoha that did not want to have anything to do with the war was Hyuga Hinata. Her devotion to her crush, or love, or obsession was so great that even with all the mental help that her family had gotten her, she refused to go against him. Even though she was labeled as a traitor, she was not forced into prison, rather she was forced to live in the psychiatric ward of Konoha Hospital. There were a few others that refused to participate in the war, all of them were thrown into prison. These traitors took up the space left by the former criminals that were willing to fight in the war. It was fight for the country in exchange for a full pardon. They chose to fight, for it was better to rest on a battlefield rather than in a cell. Mizuki was one of these people. The imposter army waited for the end of the week to commence the liberation operation. They would be breaking out the prisoners, both innocent and not, out of the Konoha prison. While doing so they would be taking out a few people and things that once gone would allow the attacks that they had planned to go more smoothly. Breaking into the village was easier said than done. They were not their daimyo, so they could not simply walk through the wall of the village. They also could not use the shadows for transportation, since for some reason the shadows refused to cooperate that much with them. The Shokan clan were no longer with them, since they were busy spying on the rest of the continent seeking information for future use. The Rosuto nins were aware of the bubble that surrounded the village that informed the Anbu if anyone entered the village through anywhere that was not the gate. They knew that by even just touching the walls the Anbu would be alerted. The only thing that they could think of doing was infiltrating the one means of entry that Konoha didn't think anyone would use, the sewers. Konoha's security bubble was like the chitin, the only way in was either from the top or from below. The Rosuto nin dug holes in the ground well beyond the bubble. They then tunneled their way to the village until they hit the sewers. They entered the village from different directions in groups of 25, so as not to arouse suspicion. The campfires were kept lit, and the camps alive with activity, so as to give the illusion that the camps were still on Hi-no Kuni's side, and that the inhabitants of the camps were not plotting against the country. The nins in the sewers hastily made their way towards the Konoha prison. They passed through the twists and turns of the roots of the great tree that was Konoha. It took them an hour to navigate their way to the underground prison. Once there, each group had 5 of their number cast a genjutsu to silence the prisoners in order for them not to alert the guards to their presence. 10 from each group then sought out the guards and snuffed out their lives. Then after the shadows devoured the boss, those assassins took the places of the guards. Once the situation had been explained to the prisoners, they let out the prisoners using the keys that the guards had on their persons, and led them to the sewers. The nins in Henge looked around the passageways that lead to the surface, making note of all the entrances and exits as well as security measures that were in place. The information was then handed over to the Rosuto nins that were leaving with the escapees. The genjutsu casters then layered a couple illusions over one another to give the illusion that there were people in the cells. Before heading back out to the campsites, the nins and their charges made their way to under the different houses that had children in them. The shadows were cooperative enough to inform then of the whereabouts of the children in the village. Once under one of the homes, the nin attacked a sealed tag right below the home of the child, then moved on. Once all the places had sealed tags attached to them, the groups made haste to the campsites. The escapees were then forced to walk through shadow gates that opened up in Yami no Kuni, so that they would have nothing to do with the war, and would be safe. It was their out and they all were forced to take it. Among the traitors of Fire Country there was at least one member from each clan that had children that were not part of the fighting force. These clansmen would look after the children when they were all in Yami no Kuni. The seal tags would be used by the Rosuto mages stationed in Yami no Kuni. The seal tags allowed the mages to force teleport the children to where they were. Price and break and mass K-pings all in one night. The Rosuto forces tried to make their way into the Konoha hospital, but there were more security measures around that place for them to handle in such a short time. They were also too complex for the infiltrators to break down and reform without getting caught in one night. They lacked the centuries worth of knowledge and experience to do that. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.